In this section, we'll look at the latter half of Carter's presidency, looking at some of the domestic issues and problems he faced in years like 77 and 1978. Certainly, during Carter's latter presidency, problems grew over affirmative action. In the 1978 Supreme Court case of Bakke versus the University of California, the Supreme Court ruled that racial quotas were unconstitutional, but the court still allowed the consideration of race in admittance or job offers. Now, what was acceptable, however, as a consideration of race was unclear, and as the this kind of represented the first challenge to the emerging affirmative action policies. It spawned a lot of considerable press and protest, but sort of ensured that there would be continued questions about affirmative action in the future. Certainly, Carter had his troubles, but you can say that later in his presidency, he did have at least some success in domestic matters. For one, he got the federal education programs combined into one department in 1979, the Department of Education, which conservatives to this day don't like, thinking it's a product, it's a area the state should be dominant. Throughout his presidency, the environment remained a hot topic that Carter really hoped to address. He hoped to build a strong record. And certainly several incidents kept the matter before the public. Most notably, there was a Love Canal controversy in 1978. It was learned after some cancer cases and some other health problems that a housing development in New York, Love Canal, had been built on a toxic waste dump and it was causing these health problems. And Carter authorized the use of federal money for a cleanup and evacuation, and it was the first time that federal money had been used for a disaster not caused by nature. Also, in 1979, the following year, a crisis emerged at a nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. A stuck valve led to the loss of the plant's ability to cool the reactor, and to avoid a meltdown, the plant had to release radioactive chemicals into the atmosphere. And it was an expensive mistake. It was scary. It cost more than $1 billion to clean up, and it really sort of led to a halt in the construction of nuclear power plants in the U.S. While these events sort of highlighted the environment, and certainly Carter, as I say, wanted to be a good advocate for it, it was a contentious issue. You're going to see Carter supporting air and water pollution protections, and he actually signed the new surface mining bill. But the environmental movement during Carter years often appeared extreme. An example of this was when there was a dam being built in Tennessee, the Tellico Dam, and just before it was completed, it was learned that a small fish was going to be wiped out, and the fish was covered by the Endangered Species Act. The dam was going to hurt this fish. And as protests grew on both sides, kind of Carter was caught in the middle. After the case went to the Supreme Court, Congress passed an exemption for the dam from the Endangered Species Act, and Carter signed the legislation. Of course, this angered the very environmental movement he hoped to win. Late in his presidency, Carter was able to get the Comprehensive Environment Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980 passed. It's quite a mouthful. It's commonly known as the Superfund Act, and it passed in large part because of the Love Canal disaster, that toxic waste dump. But the new law taxed certain chemicals to create an almost $2 billion emergency fund that could be used to clean up toxic disasters. And it also empowered the EPA to clean up sites and to charge companies or individuals who were found to be at fault for the spills or the dumps. Carter's last year in office, as you know, was hampered by a revolution in Iran. I'll talk about this more in the foreign policy sections on Carter, but there was a revolution, a coup staged by Islamic fundamentalists, and they stormed the American embassy, taking American diplomats and staff hostage. And this has been going on for over a year, and it really makes Carter appear kind of weak. He was unable to win their release. All this turmoil with the Iranian hostage crisis in the Middle East quickly reignited another wave of higher energy prices in 1979, sort of renewing the energy crisis, which had already lingered for years. Just made it worse again. And once again, Carter had to push new energy legislation, reigniting political controversy and angering environmentalists. This time, Carter got through Congress decontrol of prices to raise the cost of gas, and as I say, that would encourage conservation. He also got several taxes added as part of the deal, including a windfalls profits tax on oil companies who prospered by the higher prices. This tax revenue was slated to encourage the development of synthetic fuel, an alternative to oil. Carter believed that this 1979 energy bill was his greatest domestic accomplishment because, energy consumption did actually drop. But the new requirements and the higher prices were unpopular. Moreover, in calling for this legislation, Carter gave a nationally televised speech in July 1979 in which he spoke of a crisis of confidence in government and his administration. And he called for sacrifice and almost seemed like to criticize the American people. And the speech soon was termed the malaise speech, and it sort of unintentionally for Carter became the symbol of all of his troubles. Certainly symbolism hurt Carter. In 1979, Carter installed solar panels in the White House. And they proved expensive, however, and the technology really wasn't sufficient, and it sort of came back to ricochet politically on Carter. It didn't really work that well. Also, that same year, Carter tried to run a 10K foot race. As will be discussed in the section on culture during these years, jogging was popular, and Carter decided to enter a 10K race. He was the first president to do so. Unfortunately, it was a hot day, and he collapsed and was unable to finish. And the cameras, of course, caught it all, which kind of became, symbolic of the problems he faced as president. He just couldn't finish the race. With the higher gas prices, inflation, already high, suddenly skyrocketed in 1979. Moreover, while unemployment had dropped, it still remained high, and people once again spoke of stagflation. You can see the inflation and unemployment rate here, both high. And of course, people blamed Carter. Early in his presidency, he passed a stimulus program of spending, which critics argued contributed to the inflation. Later in his presidency, Carter appeared to backtrack. He urged austerity, such as cutting federal workers' pay, and this, of course, all increased his unpopularity. Carter did appoint Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Now, while many Democrats still favored a loose monetary policy, lower interest rates, and easy money, they saw it as a way to stimulate growth. Volcker soon pushed for a tighter monetary policy or higher interest rates to combat inflation. And Volcker's policies would play out during the Reagan administration that followed Carter, ultimately helping to end the inflation. But at the time, the higher rates were unpopular with many liberals, and it hurt Carter. With his 1980 re-election approaching, Carter's unpopularity led to actually a challenger for the Democratic nomination. Liberal Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, obviously the younger brother of JFK and Robert Kennedy, ran as a liberal alternative to Carter in the 1980 primaries. Carter defeated Kennedy in the Democratic primaries, but Carter is going to emerge a weak incumbent in the 1980 general election campaign against the Republican Ronald Reagan. Throughout the campaign, the Carter administration was frustrated by the ongoing hostage crisis. And with Kennedy's challenge in the primaries, it really made Carter a weak general campaign candidate. After Reagan ultimately defeated Carter in 1980, it's worth noting that in the years afterwards, Carter proved an activist and effective ex-president. He'd write books and he'd promote peace as international election monitor, and most famously, he volunteered for Habitat for Humanity. In any event, this concludes the section on the domestic accomplishments of Carter's later years.